Hello and welcome back to this week's episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. My name is Joshua Gibson. I'm your host, and I'm joined today by someone not necessarily involved in the weightlifting world, but someone with an indirect influence, given that I've consumed a lot of his content, thought about how it relates to training, and then subsequently reorganized my programming to kind of satisfy a few of the concepts that he discusses, and again, these aren't like unique to one person, but that have kind of been just talked about and then thought through. So without going on a much more of a preamble, I guess I can introduce Brian Miner. How's it going, Brian?
Good. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing pretty well. It's the weekend of the 4th. Well, it's the 5th now, but we can kind of date this podcast a little bit so people can get some context. But how was your holiday over the weekend, or I guess the continuation of it if you're like a corporate person, which we aren't.
Yeah.
But
No, it's been fun. We barbecued yesterday. Had some friends come over that hadn't seen in a while. So yeah, it was a good time. Pretty low key, but enjoyable. When you have families, it's always low key.
yeah, and I know you competed in bodybuilding, and we'll get an update. Obviously, we'll talk about your background a bit more. But do you still view food through a particular lens? So I know that I've tracked my food, dieted multiple times, or tried to like lose body fat multiple times, and it's kind of like a thing that's like hardwired in now. I just tend to think, in terms of protein and how many fats and how many carbs and fiber, and am I kind of meeting the vegetable and fruit requirements for the
Yeah.
day? Do you still see through a certain lens when you go to stuff like that?
Um, Stuff like that, not as much. Like a barbecue, something that's pretty rare for us to do. I'll just eat whatever. Like yesterday, I smoked like a pork tenderloin and some like chicken wings. But I guess like I was gonna do ribs and then I picked tenderloin because I'm like, if we're doing wings, that's a lot of fat. so I guess it's to some degree, but um, yeah, I mean, I haven't, I usually don't track unless I'm dieting. Like there's a lot of people that track in the off season, and I think at this point, like you said, it's kind of hardwired in. You have a general idea, and you can, I focus on getting adequate protein each day, and that's probably the main thing. It's like protein, and then just not eating like a child. It's like just having some fruit and vegetables, and it's like the rest kind of falls into place for the off season. But I'm probably looser with it than a lot of people in the off season. But it's a good balance for me. And then prep, though, it's like when I switch to like a contest prep, it's like things, I could probably lose like the first 15 pounds without tracking, honestly. But I do, just because I think that structure helps in other areas too. And I think that's one thing with tracking. There's residual benefits to it sometimes, like just getting organized with other aspects and time management and stuff. And so, yeah, I do both, but right now kind of half foot in the door with tracking.
Yeah, and I know on other podcasts, off the top of my head, I know you've been on Revive Stronger and a handful of other ones. You've mentioned maybe competing in bodybuilding again, and at that time, I think you said your last show was in 2017.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you can talk a bit about your time competing in bodybuilding and what your plans are with that.
Yeah. So I've done like 3 bodybuilding seasons. So I did 2010, 2012, and then 2017. And, each one was, progressively better, like in terms of physique, which I guess is the goal, right? So and that's one thing. Like I don't have a desire to compete unless I know like I can be improved, because it's just not a process to go through. I mean, maybe once I'm, past, because there's like masters competitors, that aren't at their all-time best, but they're still, so like I still enjoy the process, within the context of what I'm able to do. But it's a commitment for sure. Like it's especially like on the natural side. Like things just take longer, you know, getting I mean, I think I in 2017 I dieted like I had like a pre-diet because I did the Arnold Classic right before prep started. So I think I was like 215 in the off season, which is about where I'm at now. And then I cut down to like I think 195. So I was light at the Arnold because I knew I was starting prep. Then I competed as a 93, and then I went and kept dieting for basically through November. Like
Wow.
it was a long time. And I mean there were like diet breaks in there and you know periods at maintenance. And actually like between the initial fat loss for the Arnold and then this, you know, the prep, there was like I was peaking in a you know, at maintenance. I wasn't dieting
Mhm.
through the peaking process. But yeah, so it was it's a long commitment, but I would like to do it just because it's almost like it's a reminder of what you're kind of capable of doing, like your mental sort of fortitude and like I said, like your time management aspect. It's more of a for me the physique side of it's fun. The competing side is like I obviously want to do well, but the process of it is the draw. Like I,
Mm.
you know, if I could, you know, snap my fingers and be in contest shape and compete, it's like that would kind of take a lot of the fun out of it. Um, so I think it's just getting to a place where I want to do that again. Especially, I mean, the first prep I had, um, just you know, we had our son, and then now we have a son and a daughter. So like two of them, it's a little harder to juggle. So I think if I had to guess, probably not next year, maybe the year after at the earliest. I might hit it up, but yeah, I'm in no rush, I should say. But it's fun.
Yeah.
I do love this sport. It's different. It's a weird group of people. Well, it's a from an outsider's perspective, like bodybuilding is super strange, understandably so. But I think anybody can respect the discipline that goes into you know excelling at anything at that level. So
Yeah, well, and I think most people listening, this is a kind of a weightlifting slash like strength power specific podcast, and I think most people listening got involved in lifting weights not necessarily for sport or for weightlifting, but to maybe build some muscle or to get stronger or to just like look better, kind of as nebulous as that sounds.
hmm
Um, I know I got interested in it because I wanted to put on some muscle, and I think that time focusing on developing a physique clued me into more efficient ways of doing that later on. So now when I look back, and I structure some sort of program that's geared towards improving a weightlifting or powerlifting total, I know how to build in things like isolation movements or specific movements to target, say, the quads or the hips or something. And that's one of the things I wanted to talk about on this podcast is how you can, take not necessarily just a concurrent approach to training of trying to focus on muscle size, muscle strength, or, strength power, but how you can kind of get the most out of your, accessory work or hypertrophy specific work without interfering with the bigger movements and causing too much fatigue, or using the bigger movements to drive the changes in muscle size. And this is something you've kind of spoken about at length. Do you think it was partly your time in bodybuilding that influenced this, this concept or this approach,
just
or how did you kind of come
yeah,
on
my
to it?
interest in it. I think yeah, I started. I had no aspirations of competing in powerlifting when I first started training, and you know it started as bodybuilding, and I think that was like a blessing, sort of as you alluded to. You get a lot of it helps you sort of refine your thought process and how you view other things because I mean hypertrophy is such a broad like set of it's a pretty forgiving adaptation. It's like there's a lot of ways to go about doing it, not there isn't with like power and strength, but it requires a more refined approach. But I think more than anything, the bodybuilders that compete, or not necessarily compete, but like they have a base for strength, and like it's like they have more force capacity when they get into the sport eventually than a junior lifter who's been lifting for a year and just doing the compounds the whole time. And it's like I think that we're sort of in that phase where I'm kind of waiting to see, like, you see a lot of people that are kind of topping out their weight class and having to go up weight classes. And I think that we're going to see that more and more with these junior lifters that are going to have to kind of take a step back from competing,
Mm-hmm.
develop some some muscle mass, and sort of give themselves some more runway to progress. Because
Mm-hmm.
like unless you're Taylor Atwood, it's like just getting. I don't know how he does it with the just improving that much at the basically the top of that weight class, which I think he is. I'm pretty sure he's right there. Um, yeah, eventually that's you just kind of have to expand into giving yourself some more muscle to work with. But yeah, that definitely influenced kind of how I started thinking about what's the best way to do this. And I think that I'd always heard the term like power building,
Mm-hmm.
and I always kind of use that term. It's sort of like a gimmicky, marketable term to use, and people can relate to it. But I think what a lot of people think about, and I gave a talk for like one of the Kabuki Education Week things they had on, you know, ways to go about doing this. But I think a lot of people are like, okay, well, here's my bodybuilding program. Here's the lifts I want to improve. Let's just combine them and see what happens, and that can work to some degree. But um, I think any critique of a concurrent approach with anything, it's like, first ask yourself, what is the limiting factor here? Like, why can't we just combine everything and expect favorable, the most favorable outcome on both sides? And it's just a limitation of resources. It's just
Mm-hmm.
fatigue, if we want to use that umbrella term in recovery. um, and so then okay, well, that's sort of the needs analysis. Okay, is how do we manage fatigue? And then look at, okay, within both sides of this, what ways can we best acquire the stimuli that we're after, while just the greatest return on investment when it comes
Mm-hmm.
to the stimulus that we're providing. And then also, should we be focusing on both of them at the same time to the same degree? And I would say no. I would, and I don't want to get ahead of the conversation too much, but it's the majority of the time I feel should be spent with outside of like high intensity peaking environments. For somebody who's especially focused on like power building, it's like your dosing of the high intensity work should be kind of at that conceptual MEV during the like volume kind of hypertrophy driven phases, and then you just kind of turn up the knob on intensity and exercise selection specificity, and kind of pull back in other areas. But I mean, just basic periodization, like kind of the linear trend in things, and then seeing specificity increase over time too helps in most cases. So yeah, I I know we don't have an outline necessarily for this, but yeah, we can get lots of little offshoots there, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think when people try to conceptualize periodization or the programming component of it, they think of it, and this is just how I view someone else's thoughts on periodization, as like a more dramatic kind of stair step down. When in reality, for something like powerlifting or even weightlifting, I think it's a less dramatic transition from block to block, or from like phase to phase, to where it can be maybe something like if you have a competition bench slot and then you have like a assistant slot, like a feet up bench. It's just like the volume allocation changes. But if you're kind of, as you said, like focusing on building muscle, maybe you have more volume towards like a feet up or a dumbbell bench or
Mhm.
something, and then the allocation just transitions to more competition benching, a little less with say feet up or incline or something that's more targeted towards the muscles
Mhm.
and less so the actual like specific competition performance. And that's like a very simple approach to it. Is that kind of along the lines of what you're mentioning with power building?
Yeah. So if we're talking about like a focus on like a squat centric movement, I mean, I would include a lot of accessories outside the main lifts that, isolation work, obviously for someone interested in physique stuff. But if you take like, I guess an example, sort of is used on bench for squat would be, let's say you have, 3 squat days a week. We might have like a hack squat is like the primary movement on, a higher volume day. And then, maybe you do have like a power day in the middle, some priming session, and
Mm,
then maybe on that third day, it's like your competition lift, low bar squat, um, or even for some people maybe it's a high bar squat. Maybe they don't squat low bar, and or they may just need to bring up their quads a lot. Even with the low bar squat is a low bar squatter, so maybe it's a high bar squat, and they transition to low bar later. But then maybe it goes like hack squat, priming session, low bar to high bar, priming session, low bar, and then low bar, low bar, low bar,
mm,
something like that. And so I do, and that's not always going to be the case. It depends on who the lifter is, because
right.
sometimes, like for me, I don't, I do feel like I can take a week off from, or like if I squat today and then I wait a full week and squat again, I'm not going to feel too rusty. I will. It's like I get that back during warm ups. It's like
Hmm.
it's not. Yeah, I don't feel too lost in the movement. So keeping a hack squat in further for me isn't necessarily a bad thing. So I think it really depends on the person's, like if their proficiency in the lifts. But then another way to do it, like you said, is just sort of reallocating. Maybe you keep the same exercise flow in the block, and then just kind of pull back on the hack squat, reallocate it. You're kind of at that conceptual MEV, which is just throwing a dart at a dartboard in some cases. It's like, I think people like to think they know exactly where they're at, and there's just so much volatility in um, where the sweet spot is. And so I think that's definitely like just the general concept of increased specificity is when you think of it in terms of volume, um, intensity, and exercise selection. I think that gets you close most of the time. Um, Start to taper volume down as you increase intensity. I mean, that's usually going to work. It might not be, the same approach isn't going to be perfect for everybody, but I mean, that general concept seems to be pretty tried and true at this point.
I know the squat is a really useful example, especially in this discussion, given if we have powerlifters, weightlifters, even with you being on here, bodybuilders possibly listening to this. I think most people are going to figure out how to deadlift properly, bench properly, but with the squat, there seems to be more variation and performance, and I think maybe because it's, in my opinion, one of the most technical lifts. And people tend to struggle with kind of like knee position
Hmm.
down and up in the squat. And I found that having some assistance work like a hack squat or like a quad focused exercise helps drive the motor control component, but also kind of positively influences muscle size. When we're talking about, say, let's say we have a training block, we want to focus on building kind of like the quads, the glutes, the hips, whatever you want to call them. Is it kind of for you one step removed of a hack squat? Like how far down the chain are you moving when you're focusing on muscle specific adaptations to
Yeah.
drive a competition squat?
If I'm looking specifically at muscle specific adaptations, then usually it's I mean, a hack squat's pretty far from a low bar squat, like it's a ways down there. But I think that if you're focusing on muscle specific, you almost want it to be further down the list, because
Mm,
you want it to be something that's not contributing a lot of superfluous fatigue. It's like it's not, you don't have a bar on your back, you're not having to walk the weight out. It's psychologically easier to deal with for most people. And so your back isn't getting you, you're focused primarily on like quads and some glutes. Um so I think in that case it's like removing some of the fluff when it comes
mm,
to overlap is a good thing if you're focused on quads. I mean, I'll even do like leg extensions, like
mm,
that's something that I think is pretty easy for most people to recover from. It's easy to get some volume in there, that's just biasing development. But yeah, I think, as when I use that example, okay, you went from a high bar squat or a hack squat to a high bar squat. The goal there is it's sort of a shift. It's sort of like a hybrid in a sense of like, okay, we're still kind of biasing quads, but we're trying to get comfortable with the bar on our back. Um, Start to incorporate, back extensors to some degree. Um, but volume, I would generally pull back from that
mm.
movement. Like I wouldn't use a high bar squat with probably quite as much volume as I would the hack squat because of that. So I think, yeah, it's a um, something that you have to definitely pay attention to with. I think people want to use the main lifts as like these vehicles for hypertrophy, and with hypertrophy, the goal is to get the stimulus with the smallest amount of fatigue possible. And I think that's unavoidable, or like it's hard to really do that um, with the comp lifts. Like there's going to be some degree of elements of fatigue doing those that you just kind of have to manage and work around. And so, I mean, there's ways to mitigate it, but I mean, you can do, whether you're doing high reps, low reps, like there's just a lot of ways with the hypertrophy biased, exercises that you can, you know, even if you did like BFR, something like
Mhm.
there's just a lot of ways to limit. And when we talk about fatigue too, that I think it's easy to sort of use it as this umbrella term, but um, and I think we sort of look at it as this bottom line summation of all the contributing variables of fatigue. You ask somebody who doesn't really know much about like the physiology of things, what elements of fatigue exist. It's like, okay, do you feel fatigued? It's like you can answer that question, and it's just sort of pooling from all of these things that are presenting themselves. But I think with powerlifters especially, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this. It's like a lot of the fatigue side of things is it doesn't fall under the traditional umbrella of like central peripheral muscle damage, but like just joint integrity and just keeping joints happy while you're trying to achieve these other adaptations. And I think for experienced athletes who've been training a while, like managing that is starts to become more and more of a priority. And using lifts that are helping to control that and not loading. Yeah, just load management in that regard is something that like we tend to look at recovery from the curve of like performance or muscular recovery, when I mean there's a lot of systems that need to recover before we train again, to our best potential. And I think it's easy, with research that's looking at frequency for strength, frequency for hypertrophy. I mean, most of these studies I mean, there's not, these aren't training careers that we're looking at. These are like 8 to 16 week studies, and then a meta analysis that's assessing these. Um, but it's looking at one outcome. It's looking at hypertrophy or 1RM, in a leg press, something, kind of um, that may be a little bit less specific to what we're doing, but not that they don't ever look at squats or the big three, but um, it's when you look at it within the context of a training career and like the longevity requirement that's goes into like reaching your true potential. I think it's easy to overlook that side of it. And that's one thing with like hypertrophy where I think as you get later into your training career, hypertrophy, your genetic cap for size, like the idea of thinking, okay, well, I'm going to train, 8 months of the year with more, moderate intensities rather than high intensities on average, because I want to accrue volume and, adequate sets to grow. It's like, okay, well, that's a lot of time for very little return when it comes to hypertrophy at this stage in your career. Like, wouldn't it be better? The surface level argument would be, wouldn't it be better to put that emphasis on, neurological avenues and, skill acquisition and really refining the movement? And I think a case can be made for that, but at the end of the day, it's like, what's your alternative to doing volume most of the time, submaximal intensities? Like, you can't blast high intensities at high volumes year round, even if you're like the MEV for hypertrophy. It's like if you're only using high intensity work, you're gonna, most people I think are probably gonna get pretty banged up from that. Um so yeah, I think that like the volume slash hypertrophy element of, even with just power lifters, not just like power builders, um, in my training, for myself and those similar goals, it's going to be sort of a similar theme there. And especially as they are getting, more advanced, because like the alternative to it is less enticing. I think it's not necessarily, okay, we're going to grow as much as we possibly can. Like the tools are similar, but sort of the objective sort of shifts a little bit.
I think Mike T has talked extensively. Mike Tashir has talked extensively and for a long time about fatigue. And his understanding is that two things are kind of the main drivers of fatigue: psychological arousal and training volume. And I've
Mm-hmm.
been thinking more and more about that psychological arousal part. And part of what you mentioned is having some of these lower level exercises to one, accrue volume, to drive like muscle specific changes, knowing that like if you're extending and flexing your knee, you're probably improving the size of like the knee extensors or flexors. It's like it's very simple to kind of deduce down to that. But what I found with the heavier movements, even if we could do say sets of 10 in the squat and get a bigger return, is it's much more difficult to maintain that
Oh yeah.
over and over and over. And there's a point where you kind of just psychologically tap out, even if you could outperform last week. So
Mm-hmm.
say you're in a better position to hit a PR. I know for me, it's like I kind of peak in 3 weeks and I can come in and I might be able to add something to it, but the difficulty of getting up for that set is far outweighs any benefit I'm going to get. So I find in trying to build in like those lower level movements to kind of improve training outcomes and make training easier to manage tends to be more effective.
Yeah.
Um, and I found that even if like the really core concepts of fatigue, as they're written about in sports science, textbooks or whatever, exist in our heavy drivers of performance, the psychological component is critical. And considering that, and that's part of the conversation I have with people when we're talking about the length of a training block is how capable do you feel that next week we can put some weight on the bar, because performance looks great, but how do you feel about your ability to perform?
Hmm.
That's kind of like the number one question, and then you have like this flow chart down from that aids in decision making,
Yeah.
and having the light days like somewhat built in. Uh, and I think part of this is like exercise selection drives fatigue management, and that's kind of also where I've been going with my programming.
Hmm.
Tends to be really effective. Is that some
Yeah.
stuff that like
Yeah. No, I agree with yeah, everything you said there. Um, yeah, it's the psychological element, especially like if you start to get banged up and like just getting under the bar is, yeah, it's just exhausting. The other thing too, and I've noticed like that tipping point for me, um, it can just be like a set or two, for like squats. Like I can respond pretty well to relatively low amounts of volume on lower body movements, um, compared to some. But I'll be squatting, and it's like if you have to then consider like the length of the session itself. It's like if you're allocated a certain amount of time, it's like, okay, well, would I rather get all of the exercises done or every set of my squats done? It's like at some point, especially for someone who's focused on development too, it's like, well, you might be better off leaving, a set or two off on squats so you can do, leg press or, hack squats after if you'd like, or leg extensions, whatever. Because then people just end up, it's like the everyone's that's coached has probably had somebody who, they're like, okay, I got in the main lifts, I didn't have time for the accessories. And it's like that's probably like for a strength athlete, yeah, it's going to be a good rough rule of thumb. It's like prioritize the main lifts. But like if that was just the end all be all, it's like you only need to worry about the main lifts, then it's like we would never program accessories. And so it's like if that's happening on a routine basis, where people are having to skip accessories, then you have to start looking at, reallocating some of that volume. Um, but yeah, the psychological element, it just made me laugh because this has nothing to do with training. But it was the debate of yesterday, at our barbecue. We were talking about, well, one of my buddies, they're talking about the Nathan's hot dog eating competition that,
yeah.
um, Joey Chestnut, I think, got 76 hot dogs yesterday or something.
Oh my
They,
gosh.
they were gambling. They were like on their sports booking apps, like what's the over under on him this year. But someone there said, like one of our friends, Adam, they had bet him he couldn't eat 70 hot dogs in 7 days. And like on the surface, it sounds like, yeah, you could probably do that. But like I think by like Wednesday, like you would just like on paper, like you can do the squats on paper. It's like it's not that much food, but the psychological element would just crush you doing that. But yeah, totally unrelated, but made me think of that. That element of it is totally overlooked by a lot of people when they program. And then
Yeah, well, I
sustainability,
could.
like you said.
Well, I completely agree, and I'm wondering if you were to say structure a session, and I like to keep this squat centric because I'm not a great squatter compared to my
Mhm.
ability to deadlift and do other stuff. But um, how would you structure? Say, okay, obviously this is like an exercise in futility, given that there are so many things we can't consider, and et cetera, et cetera. We can go on about the limitations, but if you're going to program some sort of training block or training session for the squat, and you could even just give a rough outline of like the sequencing of the program, but what would that look like in terms of exercise selection? So I know we mentioned the hack squat. I've been playing around with almost like a deficit goblet squat to work on kind of range of motion, positioning, and then just kind of hammering the volume, getting sets like 15 to 20. Obviously like split squats, stuff like that. But do you have any like exercises that tend to be your go-to, and then a certain sequencing of that?
Um, I would say, I mean, I think quads are going to be a limiting factor for most people squatting. I mean, I know there's camps that believe hamstrings and like posterior chain And it's like, okay, well, oftentimes like you get put in these positions where those have to be strong because your quads, aren't extending the knee against the load. So it's like you can never have strong enough quads. And so I think keeping even for like a low bar squatter, having, um, keeping some quad focus in there is still important. I think that's just kind of important to get across first. Even somebody who's not squatting with a ton of, you know, forward knee travel is still going to benefit from it. Because eventually the load's going to be heavy enough where your knees have to extend, and no matter how you squat, it's like it's a rule of squatting. So, I do think hack squats are probably my go-to for like developmental aspect. I think they're like a good hack squat is tough to beat. Because it sort of checks all those boxes of, it's local, a more localized stimulus. You're not having to, um, your back isn't being challenged on a hack squat. And I think that's something like we look at breaking up these muscle groups and, allocating volume to different muscle groups. Some of that residual fatigue, can carry over. Like if you start back squatting 3 times a week for hypertrophy, like there's probably better ways to do that. So, but yeah, my top ones, I think hack squats are great. I think split squats are good. You can manipulate those based off foot position. I like, unilateral, like leg press too. And I'm not a huge fan of front squats for hypertrophy. I know that's not the question you asked, but I think when people think, okay, a lot of like knee flexion, there's just, holding that position, that front rack position is like your upper back is generally going to be the limiting factor there for most people, especially unless like someone who's a, weightlifter who's very proficient in that, it's probably less of an issue. But like there's for most people on my side of things, like with the hypertrophy and strength, it's not a great movement for that. And I don't, maybe on strength to some degree if like back extensors are a limiting factor, but I think there's probably better ways to do that too. So let's see what else. I mean, I think leg extensions, if we're looking at like localized stuff, is helpful. But if someone doesn't have, like most people have like a hack squat, a leg press, and a leg extension access to that. Like I think belt squats can be helpful. I know that there's a lot of powerlifters that are really big fans of those. But yeah, I mean, I keep it relatively simple. I mean, the like deficit goblet squats, like range of motion, something that encourages a full range of motion is going to be important. So there's powerlifters that have a hard time hitting depth, and in those cases, like I might do pause squats like at depth, but that's usually more like in those intermediate transition blocks towards higher specificity. But yeah, there's lots of squat-centric movements, like pendulum squats. I like. Most people don't have access to it.
Is that like is that a machine or something?
Yeah, it's a machine that's on a it just kind of looks like the range is sort of like that, and your feet are
Gotcha.
like on the pad here. You kind of go like that, but those are good, like because you can manipulate your foot position. Like one downside of a leg press, depending on the leg press, is the degree of hip flexion. Sometimes you limit your range of motion because you just run out of room in your hip, because you're already flexed at the hip. And so, hack squats kind of get away from that a little bit. But it's also very individual. I mean, there's people that, as soon as they start leg pressing, they get like, posterior tilt, and it's like, okay, well, this isn't a good exercise for you. But other people can like, bring their knees basically to their chest and maintain a neutral low back. And so it's different for everyone. but yeah, it's probably my go-to. I think hack squats are like one of the most underrated exercises that some powerlifters don't use. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and they're just easy. It's like you can hop in the machine. I mean, you can achieve the objective in 15 minutes. Whereas like in squats, you might be done warming up after that. So
Well, and there are a couple kind of questions baked in here that I think will help guide some of the utility of this conversation for people who want to apply it to their programming. Uh, the two I'm specifically thinking of would be one, we can talk about volume, and how you would prescribe that. And then two would be gauging the effectiveness. And what I mean by that, and I guess we can start here, is like deciding if the movement is correctly targeting the quads. And I know like Mike Israetel's talked about kind of like the mind muscle connection, kind of like feeling the burn in the targeted muscles. Is that something you consider too when you're prescribing exercise? Is it how well do you feel this? Obviously, are you able to hold position and keep like the joints in the right position, but is it like having a strong mind muscle connection that drives the use of the exercise, or is that kind of
well,
secondary?
I'd say it's secondary to mechanics. Because if you're in a position where like the moment arm acting at the knee is longer than it would be on another exercise, like you're probably going to, or like you say you adjust your foot position on a hack squat, it's like the lower down your feet go, the more it's going to target your quads, like regardless of if you get a burn, or not, which you would, I'm sure. So I think they often go kind of hand in hand. It's like I think one sort of follows the other. If something is mechanically putting you in a position to, produce, force in that muscle group, then, or, challenging and forcing you to do that, then it's going to be. And so, I think taking like kind of a bottom up approach to programming, like find the exercise first. And this is something,
Mm.
um, I've been thinking about more in how sort of the evidence-based community seems to, with this whole discussion on like training volume and like what's the optimal volume, and then like, and I've done this and I still do this with some athletes. Like, okay, I give them autonomy in what they want to pick for exercise selection. Like, okay, here's squat-centric movement. This is the goal of it. Here are some suggested options, like whichever one of these you prefer. But I think there's limitations to that to some degree. I think there's strengths to that, but having like you can't really fully appreciate the volume discussion until you look at the exercises that are being selected, and fully frame that. It's like, okay, I have 20 sets. How am I going to allocate this? It's like, okay, what exercises are achieving the goals we want to achieve? How much, what is the appropriate amount of volume that we can tolerate for each of those and benefit from? And so it's, I think just because of the way research is done and presented, in especially like meta-analyses that, give, these ranges, it's easy to sort of frame things as that top-down approach. But I try to look at it, like you said, there's all of these, it can kind of be an exercise in futility because there's so many moving parts that eventually I think, to kind of circle back and answer your original question, it's like to know if something's working, you still like performance is still going to be the best proxy over time. More so than what I think feel like sensation, like I've gotten to know and chat more with Kasim Hansen in one. He lives in Longmont, just an hour away, and we've talked some. And he's really kind of made me think more about the exercise selection side of things, like a sensation. Um, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's where the most force is being produced. It's sensation versus tension on that muscle. Um, it can be an underlying, like it can be a muscle underneath the muscle that you're working, that you're feeling, and so
Right.
it can be misleading, but I do think for the most part, like the mind muscle connection, it's like if you feel a muscle getting pumped, and like, it's probably because it's suited to the mechanical profile of what you're trying to accomplish. And so I would rather focus on that. Um, and usually that sort of happens anyway. And so I think it's sort of an argument that, in most cases, doesn't need to exist, in my opinion, where it's like you're probably, whichever camp you're in, there's significant overlap there, with probably more minimal exceptions. But yeah, he's a good resource for that stuff too. Let's see, what else was I going to mention?
Well, I mean, we could definitely get off into the weeds a little bit about perception and its role in guiding training, because I think a lot of people are familiar with delayed onset muscle soreness,
Mm-hmm.
and usually people equate kind of one-to-one soreness and muscle damage, and you can have soreness without muscle damage. So it's not necessarily completely indicative of the underlying structure. So when we talk about maybe like the perception of the burn or how something feels, I think adding in that layer, and I never considered it like that. Like, you actually don't know which. It's kind of like a nebulous soreness. It's just
Mm-hmm.
like a general sensation. You actually don't know, or you actually don't know like what specifically is sore, what specifically is burning. It's just
Mm-hmm.
like an overwhelming sensation of something
Yeah,
happening.
it's like my ass cheek is burning.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then getting more into that, I mean, you could even talk about like activation drills.
Mhm.
People put like a band around their knees, and there's nothing wrong with that. Like, if you want to do that, that's fine. But just because something is burning doesn't mean that there's actually anything happening
Yeah,
that's meaningful, right?
exactly. And I think I would 100% agree. And I think that's where, I mean, that's a simple counterpoint to that concept of, is this, burning indicative should that be one of the primary proxies that we're looking at to gauge the effectiveness? But like I said, I think there's, assuming the exercise selection isn't just purely based off of that, like if there's some, mechanical element to consider here, which I know, um, like Mike Israetel, Dr. Mike, he's gonna, like, he's still gonna pick exercises, I'm sure, that are mechanically make sense, and then maybe he uses that to sort of refine within that. And I haven't talked to him much specifically about this topic, but like I said, I think there's quite a bit of overlap, and I think the way, more often than not, probably find yourself in the same kind of conclusion when it comes to exercise selection, if you're basing it off of just, if you make a semi-intelligent decision in terms of, okay, this exercise makes sense for this muscle group, then it's probably a more reliable indicator than, I could do plyometrics and fry my quads, but no, it's not the best thing for hypertrophy. So yeah, agree 100%.
Would that mean that, okay, so kind of setting out to write a training plan or a training program, it's mostly going to be driven by biomechanics, like physics, and then psychology, like exercise preference, what keeps training fun, what keeps someone coming back to the gym, within the constraints of, okay, if we want to develop the squat, we have to do some sort of squatting pattern. We
Mm-hmm.
have to do something that supplements the exercises, or the muscles involved in the squat. So exercises that target them specifically. And then within that umbrella, a tempo back squat isn't necessarily too different from a normal back squat. And if someone wants to do some tempo squats, hey, if that's their
Mm-hmm.
squat stimulus for that training day, that's probably fine. Um, is kind of bridging the gap there of biomechanics and then
Yeah, it's just
enjoyment.
where they all kind of intersect is, I think the best way to think of it. I biomechanics and just exercise selection is the first place, I think, to look when you're, you look, ask yourself, okay, what is the long term goal? So like this is sort of taking a top down approach now and sort of meeting halfway. It's like, okay, what is the long term goal here? Where are we at in that timeline? Okay, at this point in the timeline, what is our short term goal in building towards that long term goal? It might be pretty close to where we're at, in the timeline to the meet. It might be highly specific, but further out, okay, if we're focused more on hypertrophy, okay, what is the goal here? Are we expecting to bring up the competition lifts here? Are we kind of just maintaining proficiency and familiarity at high intensities and then trying to, bring up a muscle group? And if that's the goal, then it's like, okay, like from there, once you sort of do that initial like top down assessment, you can then take a more bottom up approach. It's like, okay, here's the goal. Now, what are the tools in our toolbox to best achieve that? And the first thing we do, like when you go into a gym, if you have no idea what you're doing, first thing you do is pick an exercise to perform. That is like the epitome of like a bottom up approach. So what tool are we going to use for executing this and putting tension on this muscle? And then from there, you can have the volume and intensity discussion a little bit more. And also, in the background, okay, is this sustainable? Is this something, you then have to bring in client preferences into that as well. So a lot of it's kind of going on simultaneously, obviously, but it is, the conversation of top down versus bottom up approaches. It's both to some degree. But once you kind of get to the microcycle level of things, it's generally, something a little bit more bottom up is what I would lean on, rather than just following like a laid out plan, on paper that, okay, this does follow that trend of increased specificity. It looks great on paper, but the lifter, hates to do it. It's it's going to be that then that kind of goes off the rails. So yeah, it's kind of an overlap with all of that.
Yeah, I think that's where the abilities of the coach shines, or would shine, is like how do they react or respond to disruptions in the plan. And that's all of coaching. It's one, creating some sort of framework to operate within, and then it's responding to any changes within that kind of like overarching framework. And a good example would be some sort of tweak or injury that derails things entirely, and then you have to be super reactionary to accommodate it, adjust exercises, adjust training volumes, to ensure that that time point, which is still part of the plan, that time point never changes necessarily, is reached and you can perform at your best. And I think that's a sign of a good coach. Now, the last little layer to this would be judging the effectiveness of that plan. So we kind of talked about how you would develop a timeline. You have a needs analysis, you kind of insert everything within that, and then you kind of sift through client preferences, what's worked in the past, etc. And then how are you monitoring it week to week? Because especially with hypertrophy, it can be very, very tricky. But how do you track the effectiveness of training?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And there's not a perfect answer to the question. I think for hypertrophy, obviously the easiest answer to that would be, well, if you're getting bigger. But yeah, is a natural athlete, especially people that are someone who's probably at the point where they're programming or getting, programming with this much detail in consideration. They're probably, at least intermediate to, approaching advanced. Like that, things have already, they're past the newbie gain stage in most cases. So, so like I said, performance, I think, is going to be the best proxy you have available. But there's also considerations there. Like, I mean, you can, like the counter argument to that you often hear is like, well, you can increase your 1RM or you can get stronger without getting bigger. It's like, that's absolutely true. I mean, there's neurological avenues to strength expression that, you can have without, building, additional tissue. But when you look at things over time and like on a block to block basis, and even I think the way you structure performance, or the way you assess performance. Like a 1RM isn't a great proxy for hypertrophy. It's like looking at that, but like looking at, okay, am I able to do more, volume with the same load over time? It's like am I getting more reps, or at the, those moderate rep ranges, is the load going up? And then, exercise, looking at what exercise you're actually assessing, I think is important too, because highly skilled movements like a squat, so, like, that can be a useful tool to monitor for hypertrophy. But if it's somebody who has, a lot of volatility in how they perform, based off of, just movement proficiency, some days they are doing really well. Some days it's a little bit, whether they're sore or whatever. Um, the more, is a general rule, like the more skilled the movement, the less reliable of an indicator it probably is. And so I think that's one thing where like isolation movements can actually be both a good tool for development, but also good for assessment. And this is especially true for like bodybuilders in prep, because like as you get leaner, you end up like mechanics change, like range of motion changes, at a joint. If you lose fat around a joint, like it can actually impact, how the, range that can go through. And so I think that is probably when you see strength really take a hit for people in fat loss phases, that's one of the main reasons, is just changes in mechanics and in technique. But it's, as you get leaner, you have less, girth at the bottom of a squat. You tend to, sort of refine your movement pattern to accommodate, maybe you start squatting a little bit more upright. But all of that's going to affect the load on the bar, and it might not affect the stimulus your muscle is receiving to a large degree. It's like what's offset with a decreased load might be, gained in, a more inefficient position for that muscle, so it's like you might, the torque demand, may not change a whole lot. So it still may be an effective exercise, even though it's not going up and, it's trending down. And like my bench press just absolutely tanked in my 2017 prep. But like the stuff I was doing when I controlled for the range of motion, like some of the machines where, you can set the pins where it's, I wasn't having to bring it all the way to my chest. Like doing that, I noticed strength was maintained relatively well. Like flies, it maintained relatively well. And so the more like standardized you can keep a movement, the more reliable it'll be for assessing effectiveness through progress, I think. But isolation movements with prep, like those, are going to be less affected. Single joint movements tend to, and you see this like leg extensions, like they didn't really take much of a hit at all. And eventually, like, so you start to be limited by like substrate availability, but it's more, a lot of people, as soon as they start dieting, they're like, oh, I feel the effects of the diet. It's like, well, you've been at it like a week. You're probably, some of that's probably psychological and sort of expecting to feel weaker. But yeah, I think a lot of it's just the changes in mechanics, and using those isolation movements is going to be helpful both in dieting and gaining phases, but especially in dieting phases.
So it's kind of being more holistic in your thinking, tracking across the board. We have the entirety of a training week. How's that trending versus saying, hey, having some, more volatile exercise that maybe fatigue tends to slow you down a little bit. You don't quite have the same pop out of the bottom of a squat, so it's a little more difficult. That's going to be harder to kind of track, based on the fluctuations in fatigue. But if across the board, you're able to perform your volume sets at the same weight or more weight, and all the accessory exercises, it just demonstrates the complexity of performance, not so much like you just sucking, right?
Yeah.
So that makes sense. what I actually noticed, and just kind of an anecdote off of what you mentioned at the end, is I can lose quite a bit of body fat, body weight, and not see performance move at all. And I've
Mhm.
always wondered, people will say that they like start dieting or lose like 5 pounds or 10 pounds, like a couple percent of their body weight. And it's like, man, I feel terrible. And like, I'll lose 10% of my body weight and feel perfectly fine. And
Mhm.
I'm sure some of that's unique to the individual, but when do you start noticing, with all of the people you've worked with and with yourself, a drastic change in performance based on body weight loss?
Um, I mean, yeah, like you said, it's different for everybody, but I think for most people, I they sort of have, it kind of goes to like the set point idea, like body fat,
Yeah.
set point. It's like the further once you start drifting, you know, below that, it's sort of inevitable that something's going to take a hit. Um, but I can, like, right now I'm not much stronger at 215 than I am at 205. It's like
Mm.
I don't really feel like I get much more out of being heavier outside of just a more flexible lifestyle. It's like the performance side, I might feel a little bit more durable, but it's yeah, I don't generally lose anything until I get to sub 200 is when I start to kind of feel it a little bit and feel like, okay, my squats feel harder at the bottom. There's less, I guess, if you want to call it, like, passive force production, if we're talking about, like, using your stomach to help kind of, give yourself some support at the bottom of a squat. But yeah, it's um, that tends to be when that happens. And a lot of it has to do with like fat storing patterns of the individual. If we're talking about,
Mhm.
when um, strength sees a hit due to, technique changes, a lot of that is just where those people store body
Mhm.
fat, and so somebody, um, like a male might, who, tends to have more like visceral fat, fat around their midsection. And it's something I haven't really thought about until just now. I have noticed it does seem like men tend to see more of a drop off in squats than women
Mhm.
do with weight loss. Um, like, to the same, like, relative degree, like females that, all prep will, it'll stick around with a pretty decent amount of weight loss. Whereas, yeah, guys, it's like if they lose a lot of it, that's one of the first places they lose. It's going to be more noticeable.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, I think that's a big part of it. And then, with a contest prep, like, if you're once you get to those like extreme levels, single digit levels of body fat, it's the actual fuel source starts to become more of a concern. But early in prep, like when you're still, you should still have enough glycogen to do a set of squats. It's like it shouldn't be that shouldn't be the limiting factor. Um, so yeah, I hope that answered that question a little bit. It's hard. It's something I haven't thought a lot about.
I imagine too. It
What
depends
contributes
on,
for each person at at different time points. Um,
yeah.
yeah, it's an interesting topic for sure.
Well, I imagine too. It depends on the style of diet. So I've heard this term thrown around. I'm not sure exactly what it means, but diet fatigue. If you have something that's like very very sustainable, flexible, I think it, like for me, I just track calories, protein, and try to nail those two things, and
Mhm.
that flexibility makes it very sustainable and I mean pretty seamless with a normal kind of like dietary pattern with fat loss dietary pattern. So it doesn't, I don't feel any different. But I imagine if I restricted carbs or fats or food groups, the kind of the fatigue from like the forced elimination might have some residual effect to where I just don't feel quite as sharp in my training sessions. I actually can't prove that. It's kind of speculating, but like it seems like it could make sense.
It's a term, like, I think anybody who's gone through extended fat loss phases it's sort of like just the idea of fatigue that I talked about earlier. You ask somebody who doesn't really know the components of fatigue at the physiological level, it's like you know it when you see it, and so um, there's a large psychological element to that too. And I think there's the term diet fatigue. I've heard it more, I think, in the past year or two than I have before, and I'm sure it was coined by somebody. But I think I think most. I don't know if there's a formal definition for it, but I will say, and this is sort of similar to the way fatigue affects training. And we still don't really know all of the mechanisms behind this, but a lot of times you'll see someone who's been dieting a long period of time where on paper it's like there hasn't been a degree of adaptation, metabolic adaptation, like decreases in expenditure to justify like a plateau on the scale. It's like they're showing all the symptoms of being in a deficit, in terms of really high hunger, feeling very lethargic, which a lot of that's just tied to body fat, not necessarily energy balance. But there's times where it's like, okay, on paper, and I'm working with an athlete right now who's 3 weeks out from a show, and you get to a point where it's like we're very confident you're still in a deficit, but the scale's not moving, and I think that like stress hormones, stress from prep, cortisol levels, the psychological side of things, can start, leading to some water retention, that kind of masks, like fatigue masks performance. It sort of masks the efforts that we're putting in place. And when I sort of hear that term diet fatigue, that's one place I sort of look outside of just the psychological element. Like, how is this affecting what we see? The fat loss performance, if you want to call it that. And in many cases, like he, was trucking along, and we've had these stalls, periodically throughout prep, and then went on vacation, was able to relax a bit, saw like a 3-pound drop, it's just like, like almost overnight. And then we get back, it kind of climbs back up again. And it's just sort of this unpredictable, trending down, but it's hard psychologically. It's hard. And I think it can sort of create, for people that are, especially bodybuilders who, are generally very, highly motivated in terms of like they're just very disciplined people. It's like it wanes on them to see, be tracking things meticulously this far in and not seeing the proxy of weight loss, help that, keep them going. And if it is stress that's sort of, exacerbating the issue and, causing some, water retention, if you're worried about it, that can kind of make the situation worse. And so I think that's why, as a coach, I think especially with bodybuilders, you have to be able to try to walk them through that and the rationale of it. You have to kind of build that trust, because it's hard. It's a hard thing to trust if you haven't been through it before. But yeah, I've noticed like with a lot of people, you start, slowly adding food back in. And I mean, they've been deprived all prep, but it's like, I think part of it is like, okay, you get a little bit more food. That's, it probably helps on the hormonal side to some degree, but I think mentally it's probably just as helpful. And you'll often see, you probably heard the term like eating into shows, like where you bring calories kind of up to where maintenance is. And sometimes it's, in a more linear approach. I think there's advantages to that going into a show, just so you don't like bloat, just kind of ease yourself into more food, in ability to kind of store, more glycogen. But yeah, once you do that, you'll often see like, okay, you're closing the deficit on paper, but you're seeing weight loss go down. And some of that could be explained by, okay, well, maybe you're increasing expenditure through like NEAT. And some of that could just be, okay, they're finally like getting some sustenance to some degree, and you see this drop, and then you can see them, radically improve because they're filling out,
Mm.
in terms of glycogen, and they're dropping, some extracellular water, or, I shouldn't say extracellular, like subcutaneous water.
Mhm.
And it's allowing them to, kind of express and peak by dropping, that retention, which is part of that diet fatigue, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah, I can't agree more. I think it's funny how you can compartmentalize to looking in the mirror and saying, "I look visibly leaner,"
Mhm.
comparing two pictures, but the scale's not moving. Therefore, there's a problem.
Yeah, it sucks. And sometimes, like, depending on, where you're looking, I mean, you won't look visibly leaner yet. You just kind of
Mm,
have to
yeah.
trust. And it's weird. Like, sometimes, like, it's like, okay, well, my quads look leaner, but my midsection looks fatter. It's like, this doesn't make any sense. And like, usually there's, like, you get to a point where, and I think the more you kind of go through that experience, the easier it gets, and the less you start to experience it to some degree. Um, but it happens frequently for people, like at the tail end, like, okay, am I going to be ready for this show in time? And they're pushing, and sometimes, like, digging more. It's like you need to give yourself ample time to, like, recover from that, and so that's kind of where we're at
Mm.
with the guy I'm talking about. He's in amazing shape, but we're at the point where it's like, okay, we've been redlining it for a while. Like, let's start to kind of manage this and feel whole again. And I think that his look will reflect that. So, but it's the
Well,
that side of it's pretty fascinating. Like the stress response to dieting, and carb restriction, because I think it's more the psychological element that's increasing things like cortisol than it is the deficit.
mm.
But there's certainly a psychological element to prep.
And I've recorded, I think we recorded a show on the Weightlifting House podcast looking at acute strategies for cutting weight for competition. But I tend to kind of champion, and I think it's a little more effective on the whole. You probably get more return if you diet further out from a competition and lose weight slowly, and then kind of eat into the meat, so to speak, kind of like your approach for like a bodybuilding show.
Mhm.
Um, are there strategies, and I'm sure you have plenty of them because you've done this time and time again, but are there strategies that, say, we have some strength power athletes listening, powerlifters, weightlifters, and they want to dive into their next meet, say they give themselves ample time, and then they're going to kind of raise their calories, or eat more food up into the meet and have a little buffer. Are there strategies for counteracting um, that? I don't want to say diet fatigue. I'm making it a little too general, but the difficult aspects of dieting. So the hunger that tends to come on, um, maybe with its food selection or strategies for kind of selecting the diet, just ways to make it easier to manage.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I guess first, I think from a psychological perspective, I think, what is a strength athlete going to, what is going to bother them heading into a meet? It's like their lifts feeling awful. It's like things just not going well. And one of the biggest, like, one thing I think isn't talked about enough at all is, you know, we look at these acute weight cutting strategies, like, okay, water loading, um, low residue diets, gut,
mhm.
gut cuts, or whatever you want to call them.
I've
Um,
never heard of that gut
yeah,
cut.
yeah,
That's
gut
that's
cut.
that's
I
awesome.
think, I think I heard that. I forget who said that. Maybe Sean Noriega, but that's very effective. Like, just reducing, gut content. But before that, I mean, there's, okay, how do we get, because there's a lot of people that train above their weight class and above where they would, you know cut from. So what you see a lot of people doing is like in the points of their training, it's like, okay, when you start ramping up intensity and specificity, you bring down volume in order to kind of control for that and start to, like, part of peaking is recovering. It's a
Mm.
fundamental part of peaking is bringing down fatigue, and calories are one of our biggest allies in that process. So you're kind of pulling yourself in two different directions to some degree, like cutting volume, like, yes, that's helpful. But if you're in a deficit, it's like you're not getting nearly as much out of that peaking process as you would be if you would have just lost that, that initial cut before you started your prep for the meet. That can be an arbitrary point in time. I mean, there's what someone considers a prep. I mean, it's generally, when you look at it, it's like everything's kind of part of a prep if it's
Mhm.
building towards the goal. But let's say 12 weeks out, of a powerlifting meet, it's like if you could be within 3 to 5% of your weight class by then, that's gonna have a much better, more favorable outcome, I think, than dieting through those stages up until the day you start water loading. And I've done it both ways, and it's so much better to be able to have some calories when you're peaking, and it's just much more predictable. It's like you have a constant variable. You don't have a deficit that's operating in the background, pulling these resources. So um yeah, and you're able to, in some cases, you're able to leave a little bit more volume in because you can, um, you're not having to pull it to get that fatigue reduction to the same level. So I would say diet sooner is the biggest thing, but
Mm.
then, like, the actual, in the moment aspects of diet fatigue and just making it manageable. Um, Protein intake is, like, I'm a big, personally, I think one of the easiest parts of dieting for me is I don't get hungry when I first wake up, like at early stage, like late in prep I do, but I usually, it's 11 o'clock here. I could probably wait 2 more hours to eat, like,
Mhm.
without even thinking about it. So, for people, I do recommend people, I still try to get some protein in early. Um, but, if you're not hungry, you can kind of reallocate those calories to more, later in the day. And granted, if you train in the morning, you should, you don't want to, you want to prioritize that. But, um, sort of, not hoarding calories, because that's kind of an unhealthy way to think of it, but like the intermittent fasting sort of approach, where,
Mhm.
but modified in the sense that you're still keeping protein relatively evenly spaced. Maybe you have a shake, and your first, like, for breakfast, your
Mm.
first meal is around lunch. It's like from there, you things are a little bit more manageable. But obviously, like, whole foods, it's that's kind of the no brainer. If you're eating a lot of processed stuff, it's not that necessarily that's going to impede fat loss. It's that you're probably going to eat more of it and be more hungry, and that's going to affect the energy balance side of things, and adherence. So, um, yeah, just picking foods that are satiating and, have adequate fiber. Hydration is an aspect that I think a lot of people, um, kind of overlook. Like, most people, especially in the summers, they tend to, um, yeah, sometimes it's easy to get dehydrated and you find yourself a little bit more hungry. And I find that's sometimes the case. So, um, yeah, those, and I think protein, it's a governor for everything else, which I'm sure you've sort of noticed yourself track. And I take a similar approach when I'm dieting. It's like I don't have hard, like, carb and fat numbers, for a while. And, like, late in prep, it kind of helps to have like a smaller window there just to keep things predictable. But,
Mhm.
um, yeah, early, the first 60-70% of the fat loss, it's like I want to make it as sustainable as possible. So yeah, having something like you're doing, like a caloric range, like, okay, I know even on a day where I'm, you know, even on my highest calorie side of the range, I'm still going to be in a deficit, and sort of just regulate, within a 200 calorie range or so, based off of appetite, social obligations, then have like a protein minimum, and then, make sure you're getting adequate fat, but, give yourself some flexibility between carbs and fats is a nice way to go if you're wanting, to sort of do the light tracking approach, where you're not doing like hard numbers, which it's like, why add more structure than you need to reach your goal, if it's taking, more resources from you. Um, so yeah, those are kind of the big ones. I mean, no surprise either, right? Like, it's adequate protein, stay hydrated, whole foods. I mean, there comes a point where, especially as you drift below your set point, where it's like, no matter what you do, like, you're going to be hungry constantly, in a
Hmm.
prep like that. There's that like 24-hour, like, your baseline hunger is, your feeling of full is what your feeling of hungry was in the off season, so it's that gets a little bit harder to manage. Sometimes, coffee can help a little bit, but it's like, that's not really something you want to encourage, because that can kind of get out of control late in the game too. So um,
I think you hammering the point home about one flexibility, flexibility leading to sustainability, and that's not like being flexible. Like, oh, today was like I was in a calorie deficit, or I ate kind of under my needs, so tomorrow I'm just going to eat whatever I want. Like, not that flexibility,
mhm,
but flexibility in food choices, meal timing, um, meal size, ratio of macronutrients to some degree. And then it kind of mirrors the same approach to training we mentioned. It's like the
mhm,
taking into consideration the psychological aspect of training, how that kind of like cognitive fatigue plays into training decisions, training structuring. And I think, when we start out in lifting, it's very much like I want to do everything and do it by the book. And then as you have been in it for 5, 10, 15 years, you're just like, I just want to train. And today I might go a little heavier. Today I might go a little lighter.
mhm,
Um, but I'll just do what I can and take what's there. And tomorrow I'll do the same thing. And I do
mhm,
that enough over time and I get better.
mhm,
Um, which, like, a lot of people are kind of like, I guess, scared to take that approach because there's a lot of uncertainty, because you're responding to day-to-day fluctuations. And granted, you have an outline or a structure, but you know how to, again, take advantage of the situation less so than being, Wizard of Oz and having this predictive power and
mhm.
governing everything from the top. And
Yeah, I mean, I think just the ability to leverage auto regulation tools is, I mean, it's much. Someone who's just starting out is going to have a hard time like fully leveraging that, whereas someone who's pretty experienced, like you said, and I think for some people, like, the idea of, okay, go in, if you're feeling it, go a little heavier. If you're not, it's like they hear that and they're like, that seems kind of like fly by the seat of your pants. Like, no, that's odd. But you sign the tagline of auto regulation, they're like, oh, I've heard that.
right.
Yeah, so they yeah, and essentially, I mean, there's lots of ways to auto regulate, but it's taking into account all of these checks and balances and how they affect performance and recovery. So yeah, it's an
and,
acquired
and
skill for sure.
Well, and I know you probably follow Jeff Alberts,
Mhm.
maybe the most jacked guy I've ever seen, who's like
Yeah.
also like in his mid 40s. And it's funny on his
He's 50.
post,
He's 50. He just
there's
turned 50.
oh, he's 50.
Yeah.
Ooh, if you guys don't
Pretty
follow
sure.
Jeff Alberts on Instagram,
I'm pretty
yeah.
sure he's 50.
But if you look at his post, and what I like to do too is I'll post my training, and then I'll post a little detailed account of why I'm doing what I'm doing, how I made the training decisions. And he's like, "Yep, didn't do this today, didn't feel it, didn't do this, did this," and they're like, I mean, that doesn't even look like what you set out to do that
Mhm.
day. But again, he's been in it for 20 plus years, 25 years. He's just doing what he can to maintain performance or slightly improve, and
Mhm.
just stack chips. And I think that's really good insight into, how a
Yeah.
veteran approaches it.
Oh yeah. No, he's one of my favorite bodybuilders in that regard, especially because he's like, it's so easy. Like, like you said, when you first start out, you want everything's like very calculated, and especially when you start to get interested in the intricacies that, it's like training can be as complicated as you want to make it, and it's not necessarily going to be better. So he's just like stripped out all of the stuff. Like he understands the concepts of what he needs to be looking for, but he's not like, okay, well, I'm only doing, I need to be doing between 15 and 20 sets. It's like he's not letting that like cloud his decision making.
Mm-hmm.
And he's just he knows what works for him. It's like one of the people that you can kind of say like it works for me. It's like it clearly does. Like this isn't you figured this out over time. But it's funny, like some of the criticisms like that you hear of approaches like that from like the younger lifters. It's like, and I think even 10 years ago, because I mean I've known the guys at 3DMJ for a while because I worked with them in one of my first prep or 2012 I did. And so I've known Jeff a while, and I remember, originally I'm like, he's, some of this is like, why is he training with this little volume? It's like some of these other guys, like, wouldn't he be making more progress off of, a little bit more? And it's easy to sort of armchair quarterback some of those like veteran guys. And I think, I mean, a lot of young athletes do that. But I remember there was a guy, I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's a bodybuilder. His name's Marshall Johnson. He's, he's probably like mid to late 50s now. But I saw a show, it was like the Yorton Cup, which was like the biggest show of the time, 2012. And Marshall, I think he was over 50 at that point, like 51 maybe. But I didn't know that. So like I saw him walk out on stage and like just disgustingly peeled, like just looked incredible. Like to this day, like the most impressive conditioning I've seen in person. And then I found out, he was like 52 or something like that. And so it was incredible. But then this was sort of like during the area of flexible dieting when it was like people were discovering it. And like, okay, this is the way to diet. You should track your macros, and sort of taking this, myopic view of it. And I remember like on Facebook, or he did like a podcast or something, and he basically never tracks his food at all. Mm. And just kind of, he's just figured it out. But I remember like when he said like, I don't really track my food for shows. Like I'm eating mostly the same thing. And then when I hit a plateau, I just eat a little bit less, and it's like, it's like you could tell like the type A personalities, are just like, you should be tracking, it's like, well, like, look at this dude. the results speak for themselves. Like if anything, he's like mastered his craft, he's just so in tune with what he needs. And I think you don't really fully appreciate that until you get older in your training career. And it's something like, I mean, I'm starting to appreciate a lot more like in the past, 5 years. But yeah, the people that that are that in touch, have been training that long, like there's a reason they can get away with that. And it's not something that should really be mimicked at a younger age necessarily, but something that you should let sort of unfold for yourself and trust your instincts in some cases.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I don't think there's a better way that we could wrap up this show. And Brian, I know you have a website and you publish articles on there, and we kind of mentioned off air on getting back into it, but where can people find you if they do want to, read more, listen to more, find more content that you've been involved with?
Yeah. My website's myojournal.com. It's a blog essentially. I haven't written it for a while, but like all my coaching contact form and everything is there. And Data Driven Strength wrote an article for me last summer, I think, which has gotten really good response there. Really good article on proximity to failure for strength. Then I'm on Instagram at BD Minor. I've been on decent handful of podcasts, like Revive Stronger. I think I've been on there 2, maybe 3 times. Well, a bunch. I think I'm always trying to remember the names of these because that one just sticks with me. But yeah, if you just YouTube my name, you'll probably find a number of them. So yeah, that's probably the best places. Email, I think, is in my Instagram if you want to email me. But yeah.
Yeah, and all I did was go into, I think, iTunes or YouTube and type in Brian Miner, and progressive overload appears numerous times.
Yeah.
And
It's like the topic I'm like so tired of talking about, but I still get asked about it. And it's like, if I'm getting asked about it, people feel like there's value, I'll talk about it. But yeah, it's it is a very misunderstood concept still, but yeah.
Yeah,
There's plenty
awesome.
about outside of that I've talked about.
Sure. Yeah. So if you guys want to listen to more about progressive overload, kind of like that concept of stimulus to fatigue ratio, or something thereabouts, you can look for podcasts with Brian. If you want to listen or read more of what I've done, you can go into Weightlifting House, type in my name. You can go into Instagram and type in Josh_Phil WL. It's PHILWL. You can follow me on YouTube at Philosophical Weightlifting, and kind of getting tired of saying all this stuff. So if you want to find something, just type it in Google, and I'm sure it'll direct you. Hope you guys enjoyed this week's episode of the podcast, and we'll catch you guys next time.
All right. Thanks a lot.